Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast, where we talk about everything related to language learning. My name is Clayton, also known as George Pig, and I manage the community here at Refold. Today, our guest is Israel Lai. You may know him by the handles Clowergen or Rhapsody in Lingo. He is a polyglot and a longtime language nerd who has a language blog and a linguistics podcast in Cantonese. All right, Israel, it is good to finally have you on the podcast.
Yeah, great to finally talk. I've known you for so long without actually speaking to you.
Yeah, it's been about 2 years, I think. And
God.
yeah, I think you've known other people in the Refold community a lot longer, actually.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, Isabella from the language blogging community.
Oh, okay. How did you know that? Yeah.
Well, we've talked about it.
Have you? Oh, yeah, yeah. I've known her since I was a teenager, I think, which is revealing my age, I think. Yeah.
How old are you, Israel?
Is that the question you want to start with?
I do, actually.
Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, it's funny because recently lots of people have been asking me that, and then every time I have to do some mental maths because I'm at that age now where I have to do maths. But I am 26, going on 27.
Okay. You're about as old as I thought you were. Gotcha.
Okay. Good. No surprises then.
So, do you want to introduce yourself for the people who may not be aware of who you are?
Yeah, sure. Let's see, where do I start? I am a composer, first and foremost. I'm doing a PhD in composition here in Manchester, which means I write music for people to play in concerts and stuff. And when I want to procrastinate on my music, such as this very moment, I do language things. I grew up in a trilingual, in some sense, environment. And then in undergrad...
What 3 languages?
Oh, yeah, of course. I'm from Hong Kong. So my family speaks Cantonese. Most of my society speaks Cantonese, but we learn English from a very early age. Not necessarily well, but we do that. And then we learn Mandarin for a couple of years in school. And that comes very naturally to us because we write in standard written Chinese, which is basically Mandarin. So we just learn to pronounce it. And then in my undergrad, I started doing German in university and sort of kickstarted my language journey on my own. I started with lots of the online polyglot community, the classic polyglot YouTubers and forums. And then, so 10 years on, I now run my own language blog and YouTube channel, Rhapsody in Lingo. I talk about languages, of course, my journey with them, or I increasingly give talks about languages and language learning. And I also have a podcast in Cantonese about something slightly more towards the side of linguistics. And that's long and short of it.
And your podcast in Cantonese has written Cantonese transcripts, right?
Oh, yes. That's sort of one of the aims of my podcast in general. So I wanted to increase the amount of Cantonese being used in different domains because we were talking earlier, right? Cantonese is one of the languages that are commonly limited to a couple of domains. People only speak it in their daily lives and so on. They don't really think of using it in like academic contexts or anything that's more sophisticated. So I thought we're going to try to talk about Cantonese and more importantly, write or in this case, transcribe all this linguistics babbling in written Cantonese. And that's hopefully that's contributing to the world of written Cantonese a little bit.
So when you talk about linguistics in Cantonese, are you using like standard written Chinese linguistics terms, or are you using English terms? How does that work?
Yes, that's a good question. I was just talking about that with my co-hosts. So only one of us has an actual background in linguistics. So he studied in English. So all the terminology he knows, as well as the stuff I've learned from the internet, because it's the internet, everything is in English. So oftentimes, especially when we started out, we had to look up what the Chinese words are. And the fun thing about Chinese languages is that you can, especially with technical things, right? With daily life things, they vary a lot, but with technical terms, you just take the standard Chinese term and you pronounce it in Cantonese, and voila. So that's what we had to do a lot in the beginning. We actually had to look up what a vowel and a consonant is in Cantonese. But at this point, we're 50 episodes in, and we sort of got used to the basic jargon. And it's just once in a while, we have to talk about like morphosyntactical alignment, and then we have to look that up on Wikipedia. But otherwise, it's like second nature, which is funny because when I talk to normal people about things that they should know, like vowels and consonants, they have no idea what the word is because they also learned that in English.
And that's pretty normal, I think, for Hong Kong Cantonese anyways, to have some degree of code mixing.
Oh, a high degree. Even personally, I do that incessantly.
Now, I did have a question. What is your background with language specifically? So you mentioned being raised in a trilingual environment, and you mentioned Mandarin, Cantonese, English, a bit of German. It seems like you're kind of internet famous for your Welsh ability and your Welsh studies.
No way. I've barely started. I can't be known for that. Okay. So first of all, I would not say that I grew up in a trilingual environment specifically, because the environment itself is pretty monolingual. It's just the school, the education that I received was multilingual. And then, I'm going to quickly go through what I've had so far. So I have a rule that I should avoid learning similar languages because I'm extremely scared of mixing up languages. So I did some French in school just as a... I went to a school where they had like basic French classes. So I didn't go very far. And then I went to Alliance Française when I was in secondary school. And then I went to Duolingo after that. But that's the extent of my French. I did German in uni, and then I spent a year abroad in Sweden. That's where I learned Swedish. Yes, that breaks my rule. But I will live there, so I sort of had to do it. I don't have to, but I wanted to do it. And because I learned Swedish way too fast, I had some free time, so I started Polish. And that is sort of my signature language at this point, because I have learned / am trying to learn it to an advanced level, to a level where I can use it as comfortably as English.
I've heard people praise your Polish.
Oh, I'm still working hard. I sometimes struggle when I'm speaking it. Really depends on what I'm talking about. It's
there's an active community member in Refold, Bart Bartłomiej, Polish name, who has spoken highly of your Polish.
I've yet to meet him. Okay.
I cannot pronounce his name in Chinese, but he's got a Chinese handle. I can't read it. So you've probably met him and just don't know him by the name Bart.
Okay. Yeah, probably. Yeah. Yeah. So anything beyond that, they are sort of relatively like side projects. Learned some Hebrew, Taiwanese, and then more recently Welsh. And I just started a bit of Turkish as a fun project thing. Those languages, they don't mean as much to me as the previous ones did, because of how long I've been doing them and because of other connections in my life.
Yeah. So what is it like learning a language like Welsh, where the community's pretty much totally bilingual? It's obviously a minority language in its own country.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Have you heard of just as a side note, have you heard of the Welsh government's goal to reach 1 million speakers by 2050? I
know almost zero about Wales.
Okay, that's
they have good. A lot of castles.
They have very nice castles, and they are like 2 hours from where I am. But yeah, so they split of statistics, they are at around 17% Welsh speaking at this point, and they're trying to get the number to 1 million by 2050, but that would still be less than 40% of the whole population. So like even if they reach their goal, they are still a minority language in their own country. So that's sort of something that everyone has come to accept, but it's sort of about finding a way to live and to build communities, linguistic communities, despite being a minority. And it's interesting because there's a lot of stark contrast between how the government values it as the official language, even if it's just lip service. There's a lot of Welsh that is used in government or in public services, but at the same time, there's a good portion of the Welsh population that are very against like imposing Welsh on them specifically. So yeah, it's an interesting dynamic that we don't have in Hong Kong, even though we often say that we are becoming a minority language. Yeah. So how it's like to learn it, and it's mainly the resources, isn't it? Because it's not even about whether it's a small portion of the population. It's just because of the fact that it is quite small. So compared to your Russian, your Spanish, or French, there's going to be very little resources to use. So when you want to get some TV,
And when you
have one channel.
say resources, are you referring to like language material for learners, or are you referring to
that? Yeah. So language learning resources. There are a lot of old textbooks. There are some new ones, but the new ones are mostly standardized around one curriculum, and that includes Duolingo. And that's
you're not a fan of that curriculum, right?
I've got nothing against the curriculum itself, but I'm against the fact that everything uses the same curriculum.
I feel like I've read a blog post of yours where you talked about this.
Oh yeah, I managed to piss off some people, but I still think that to make language learning effective, we need more diverse resources. Like I would love to have like 3 different textbooks covering the same thing from different perspectives. So that's the state of it. And resources also include people to talk to, and obviously it's not easy to find someone to talk to when it's a minority in their own country. So it mostly comes down to more online tutors and like meetups of Welsh speakers and learners, and those are quite active. But you need to seek them out and go to them specifically. You just can't walk up somewhere and expect someone to speak the language to you.
With Welsh specifically, I was under the impression that there were actually quite a lot of services in Welsh. Like, I think there's like a sort of a national broadcaster that has programs in Welsh, and it seems like very much like a global North language, whereas like you've got some languages in the global South that have like way more speakers than Welsh that have almost no support.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas Wales is still a relatively wealthy part of the world, and the government does try to support it. So like you can find media in Welsh.
Yeah, that's a saving grace. Because I know lots of languages, they don't even get much recognition, which is where Welsh was a couple of decades ago. But ever since people got more aware of these issues, they try to revitalize it, and it's got governmental support. So there's a lot there that is being offered by way of government funding. It's not always effective or correct. You get lots of wrong Welsh around the country. You see signs that make stupid mistakes. But yes, it is on a very good path towards revitalization, especially with the broadcaster S4C. It is coming up with very good programs, I have to say. Yeah, it's just a shame that with British television in general, they just expire after 2 weeks, and then you can't watch it when you have to spend like 1 week to understand one episode.
Gotta find a way to grab them and save them for later.
Someone knows how to do that, I'm sure.
So I do have to ask, Welsh is famously split into two varieties, North and South, ignoring Patagonian Welsh in Argentina. What do the materials teach? What is the kind that is broadcast? Is there a standard Welsh they sort of aim at? I've heard this is a lot with a lot of minority languages being revitalized in Europe, where the dialects can actually be quite divergent, and there's often an artificial standard. What do they teach? What do they use for broadcasting?
That's a good question. So with lots of majority languages, they have gone through a phase of like nationalism. That's why they create the national language out of the natural state, which is mishmash of dialects. And with Welsh, so most people say that they have two varieties, but honestly, there's way more than that. So as far as I know, so don't quote me on that, as far as I know, there are 5 main varieties. You can group them in North and South. And at the end of the day, it's just about what words people use in their families, in their communities. So they simplify the grammar in different ways. So for example, it is not in formal proper Welsh is neither do. And some people say dydi, some people say do. So you see the taking out the sounds in different ways. So, but at the end of the day, it's sort of the same grammar, the same words. And with the mass media, they are also very accepting of the varieties. And that's the thing that they're actually proud of, especially when you compare them to English. Because English is always like, oh, we got the perfect Queen's English or King's English now. And then you have the dialects, the accents that are inferior to that, and that they sound funny and so on. But in Welsh, they're always like, yes, we have so many different ways to speak Welsh. We even have sort of a learner's Welsh, which is what people learn to speak when they go to classes. They speak at a fluent level, but without the familial background. So that's a new variety of Welsh that is being created by whoever's making the courses. There's like a new Cardiff Welsh that is like a mix from people moving into the capital, etc., etc. So they are very welcoming towards all types of varieties from all types of people, and I think that's a good thing, because if you start doing you start dividing people instead of uniting them, it's not very conducive towards the revitalization. And that's why on TV you see all of them. From my experience, I mostly hear Southern Welsh, but that could be just the kind of shows that I've drifted towards. I have no idea.
So to totally go off topic here, off of Welsh,
Sure.
And onto your other languages, how do you handle that wanderlust? You've got like 8 languages sort of in various levels of maintenance and learning and activity. How do you handle the wanderlust? How do you it's quite difficult, because I feel like a lot of Refolders have 1 or 2 max. You can sort of divide the lingosphere, the language spaces online, with people who like language because they like language, like us, and people who like a language because they like the culture or the media, which I would say the vast majority of Refolders fall into. People learning for anime,
normal people
learning for dramas. Yes, normies.
I wouldn't say normies. Normal people, not weird geeks. So what do you mean by wanderlust? You mean like want to go to the place to explore the culture?
No, not wanderlust like physically, but like linguistic wanderlust. How do you stop yourself from just being a hyper dabbler and changing language every other week?
Oh yeah. I think for one, the rule that I said earlier about avoiding similar languages really helps, because usually I see with people learning like 10 languages, they learn one, for example, Spanish, and then they discover neighboring cultures and they get interested in those cultures and learn those languages. And because of my role, I don't fall into that trap. So like I can enjoy similar cultures, but since I try to avoid learning that language, I end up not going very deep into that. And also it's not like a low-hanging fruit. So I know that if I want to learn a new language, for example, Turkish, there's going to be a steep learning curve. So if I actually start doing it, there is a sense of commitment. So, for example, there have been other languages that I've dabbled in. I'm not ashamed to say I dabble. I used to dabble more, I think. But I make it clear that whether I'm learning something for real or not. So, for example, with Welsh, with Turkish, my newest languages, I also started dabbling. And then at some point I decided, yeah, I really enjoy this. I want to go further with this. I'm going to make it official, well, YouTube official, and go on with it. I don't know whether I actually go to a decent level at the end of this, but at the same time, I want to make it part of my life, so to say. Whenever I make a list of languages that I speak. I only count the ones that I actually feel a connection to, whether or not I speak them well. So that could be something I've learned for a long time, something that I plan to learn for a long time. That's how I sort of compartmentalize them in my head. I make it very clear. Yeah. It still happens. Like sometimes, for example, I've been in a BSL class for 2 semesters. I enjoy the process of learning it. British Sign Language, for those who don't know.
Is this your first signed language?
The acronym. Yes, it is. Unless you count the alphabet that I learned as a kid in school. That's the American alphabet.
And what signed language do they use in your home area of Hong Kong?
Hong Kong Sign Language.
So there's a Hong Kong Sign Language.
Yeah, so that is a language that developed out of deaf schools that are established by people who came from Shanghai. So it is an offshoot of Chinese Sign Language. But because we don't have an alphabet in Chinese, or Cantonese for that matter, we use the ASL, American Sign Language alphabet, for any English words that we might spell. But yeah, I've been learning British Sign Language for 2 semesters, and I really enjoy it. And I feel like it's something that is important to me as some sort of vague language activist. But at the same time, I'm not like connected socially or mentally. I'm not connected enough to the language or to the community. Obviously, that's what I had in mind. I'm not connected enough, or I don't feel connected enough to the language itself or the community to make it a core part of my multilingual life. So even if I do continue learning it, it's gonna take a while until I would say, yeah, I signed BSL. That's where I draw the line.
Signed languages are fascinating.
Oh, absolutely.
Because what a lot of people who are not familiar with them are not aware of is that they vary quite differently. You've got different signed language families. For example, I think ASL is a descendant of French Sign Language.
It is.
And in some countries, there's even a split. So, for example, in the Philippines, there's Filipino Sign Language and American Sign Language.
Oh, okay.
And they both exist. Filipino Sign Language has the most official support, but particularly in some parts of the country that had a lot of Peace Corps workers, the deaf schools were set up by Americans. And there's actually a split where not all deaf Filipinos speak the same sign language. You've got some who were taught the American way and some who were taught the Filipino way. So some deaf communities have totally different sign language from the other in the same country.
That is wild. Yeah. And are those completely unrelated languages? Or
I actually do not know much about FSL. I assume so, but I'm not really sure.
Right. Yeah, because just this morning I learnt about Catalan sign language and Valencian sign language, and those are things that exist in Spain, and apparently those two are more similar to each other than they are to Spanish sign language.
Okay.
And yeah, but that's the extent that I know about them. It's just interesting that those regions have more of a regional identity, and then they have their own sign language.
Yeah, very interesting. So I would love to hear more about your journey with BSL in the future.
If I actually get anywhere with it.
If you get anywhere
Hopefully.
with it. There's one lady who I've actually been wanting to reach out to she's made a couple of update videos on YouTube, who's refolding, so using the immersion method, for ASL. And I think that would be fascinating because actually, I'm ashamed to admit, I do not know a lot about signed languages. It's sort of a black spot in my knowledge about languages and linguistics.
Yeah, that's normal. I feel like when you talk to anyone who's into languages, when you look at if you pick any 20 YouTube polyglots, for example, you hardly find any signed language. Yeah, the only one I can think of is Richard Simcott, who did one video of BSL numbers like 12 years ago, but I don't know where he's at afterwards.
If he kept with it, he'd be quite far. He's so
good at it.
He's the real deal when it comes to a polyglot.
Yeah, but most people don't think about signed languages a lot because they are so. I mean, they are everywhere, but at the same time, you feel like they're very removed from you, socially and also in terms of the language, the nature of the languages themselves.
Yeah, I don't know. I definitely think that it would be worth me going down the ASL route at some point in the future.
Sure. I would absolutely encourage anyone to learn a signed language. I feel like it's such an important thing. Because for so many people, learning a language is just a hobby. Especially, I guess, on Refold, people doing it for fun, to enjoy the culture. That is a perfectly fine reason. But at the same time, there are just all around us, there are these languages that are being used by so many people. And if we could just learn a bit of them, we would do them a huge favor, just to make their lives easier. And it's important in a different way from, for example, learning an immigrant language. And so I think it's very much worth doing, even just a little bit.
Yeah, I know two signs, and I don't know if they're in Filipino Sign Language or American Sign Language. You take like this for thirsty. This means woman. And at one point, I dated a teacher, and special education teachers need to know a bit of sign language as part of their curriculum. So I do have a few signs. I'm quite fond of this one for telling someone I'm thirsty if I can't talk. So I definitely think it's useful, even just to have a way to communicate non-verbally with other speaking people.
Yeah. I always feel like this is a more selfish reason to learn sign language, but I would very much love if other people could just sign with me, even if we're all hearing, because there's so much more you could do. You could sign over a long distance. You could sign in a noisy club. Sometimes when I'm in a noisy environment, I just keep shouting and nobody gets what I'm saying. And I'm like, I want to shut up now. Let's just sign. But yeah, it's not very practical, sadly, at this point in time.
So, yeah, I don't know. That's fascinating. BSL, Welsh, Polish. So
I have a very eclectic and weird mix. I know, not exactly a typical bog standard.
Yeah, I think so I cannot remember all of your languages, but I think Welsh and Hebrew are two that are not super commonly learned.
Yeah, these are usually limited to a specific demographic. So Welsh usually for people who are raised in Wales and want to reconnect with that side of their culture and identity, and Hebrew obviously for people who are moving to Israel, which they still do a lot, and they have very good schools teaching them. So these are both
is the word
demographics that
for
I'm not in.
The word for the Hebrew teaching schools?
Ulpan.
Ulpan. Okay.
Ulpan. And funny story. So there was actually an Ulpan in Wales, or at least there was. So they copied the method from Israel and made it their own thing. And because it's Welsh, they changed the U to a W, which is the corresponding vowel in the U vowel in Welsh. But I'm not sure if it's a thing anymore. They probably like merged it into some of the standardized courses. But it's funny coincidence.
Yeah, so obviously you're taking Polish to a very high level. That's sort of your bread and butter. But in Polish, again, it's not a small language. Like, again,
No.
people may not be aware that it's the second most like widely spoken Slavic language.
Oh, absolutely. It is huge.
So it's definitely like it's a big language, but not a big language at the same time. It's got millions of speakers, but at the same time, I'm assuming the content, a lot of it's going to be in English, or it's limited to one country, more or less.
Yeah,
not including diaspora.
That's the thing. I remember you saying sometimes we say lesser spoken languages when we mean lesser studied languages. Yes.
Yeah.
So Polish is definitely one of the latter category, and it is weird that it's so infrequently studied because Poles are everywhere
in Europe.
I mean, yeah, or in the global north, I guess.
Yeah.
But they, I don't know, I don't have statistics, but I feel like they are one of the most widespread diasporas after, I don't know, like Mandarin, Cantonese communities. And it makes a lot of sense to learn it. And for example, in a country like the UK, you go to McDonald's, you go to a kiosk, it has English, Welsh, because it's a official language, and Polish. And we keep joking that it is our second official language in this country. Especially if you go to places like Scotland, and there's a lot of Poles there. It actually makes more sense to learn Polish than any other language over there.
I believe it. I think Polish has a sort of a status similar to Spanish in the U.S.
Oh yeah, actually, yeah. Good point.
Yeah, a large immigrant community.
Except in the US, you do learn Spanish a lot, and in the UK, nobody learns Polish.
We do. I had 2 years of Spanish. Not a lot. I think they start kids younger these days. I'm not really sure. But we do have a little bit of Spanish for sure.
Yeah. Well, when you talk about language learning, most people think of Spanish.
For sure.
Yeah.
And I think it's a little bit unfair because Spanish is often seen as an easy language, whereas Polish is not seen as an easy language. So
yeah,
I feel like
forgot about that part. Thank you. Yeah, Spanish is hard for me for some reason, and that's really ironic.
It's because you can't trill your R's.
That is one part of it, and it's an excuse that I have because Spanish requires you to differentiate between the r and the r. But yeah,
that sounds almost Czech.
Oh my god, no! Yeah, I knew it. My trilled R is way too airy.
It sounds like it's almost voiceless. Maybe something's up about it.
That could be it. Yeah, I don't know. I can't figure it out. But the language itself, it's hard to say why. It's just, as young people say, I'm not vibing with it, and I think that's absolutely fine.
So English and Spanish are really not that close in a lot of ways, but they share a lot of vocab, and I think that causes people to think it's going to be easy. But there's a lot that's foreign in Spanish for English speakers.
I can't speak full Spanish, but I speak some French, and to me, it is way harder than German. people think German is really hard because it's got all the grammar stuff, but at the same time, the way they phrase stuff is more intuitive for someone who speaks English.
It's a
Like
Germanic
in
language.
French, there is a, yeah, exactly. So in French, I assume in Spanish as well, I don't know, there is no way to say things like how big, how small, how long. You can't just put those words together. You have to rephrase it to ask the same thing. So what is the distance? What is the length? And that is actually one of my greatest weaknesses in French, because sometimes I just have to rephrase something on the fly.
Yeah, I definitely think that the shared vocab in some of these Romance languages with English gives the illusion that they're quite easy to learn, because they're easy to learn to understand.
Yeah.
But outputting is actually quite difficult when you get into, for one, Romance verbs tend to be quite difficult for English speakers. You know, they've got multiple moods. The conjugations can be tough. I personally have always found analytic and agglutinative languages to be easier than fusional languages. So things,
Yeah.
I feel like there's a greater mental burden with the fusional languages. And I definitely think that Romance verbs are quite foreign to English speakers.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I remember when I started speaking Polish, it was literally like doing maths in my head, because you're doing lots of calculations, like this works with that, and this goes this here because of this, and then you're thinking about 10 different parameters in one sentence. It was insane. It's just that at some point, it just became natural to me. Sometimes I still have to think about how to conjugate a verb, because they are never perfectly regular in any language unless it's Esperanto. So sometimes with the odd verb, I'm like, okay, crap, that's a different one. How does it go? But otherwise, at some point, you just get used to when to use what forms of the words, and that's a comfort.
So, out of your languages, what is the most interesting language that you've dabbled in?
Interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be
specifically the ones I dabbled
interesting.
in.
Specifically, the ones that you've dabbled in.
Okay.
What have you found interesting? So again, what's interesting is going to be different for all people. But for you specifically, was there something that you found interesting? Because you sort of have dabbled in at least 8 languages, if not more.
I have. Oh, that's a hard question. I might go for Japanese.
Japanese, really?
Yeah, it's funny because not many people dabble in Japanese. They usually go all in. But Japanese is a language that, well, at the time I wouldn't have said I was dabbling in, but in retrospect I would, just because of its relationship with Cantonese, I would say, because you have all the shared vocabulary through whatever contact they had with ancient China, but then the grammar, the structure is so different, and then they have interesting ways of phrasing certain things. When in English we have modal verbs, for example, can, should, things like that. You sort of have an entire phrase just to say that thing, and then they have so many. What's the word? They have onomatopoeia, and then they have the words that are trying to emulate the feeling of something, and it's completely foreign to me. So when I hear and especially read Japanese, there's a lot that is very familiar. Even the loan words in Japanese usually sound more like Cantonese than they do than they sound like Mandarin. So there's a lot that I recognize, but then everything else is just whoa. So yeah, that contrast is very interesting to me.
Yeah, the Japanese sound symbolism, like pika pika being something that's sparkly or something, is quite interesting. But I think actually that's not unique to Japanese.
It's unique
I
among
think-
the ones that I know well.
Oh,
Anyway.
that you know, yeah. I feel like some other languages do this. I feel like it's quite common in African languages. I think some South Asian languages. But
Yeah,
it's
I think
definitely,
so.
yeah, definitely Japan is probably the best known for
The best
it,
known.
I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, for that sort of sound symbolism, ideophones.
Earphones. Good word.
Mhm. And you dabbled in Japanese. How long ago was that?
Oh, okay. So when I was an actual kid, I
You're an
went
actual
to
kid.
I went to some Japanese classes. I went to some Japanese classes, and it was not a very good class. So I got the basics of it, and that was it. And then around the time when I was discovering just the polyglot community in general, I had just learned German, and then I wanted to do an experiment and see how easy Japanese would be for me as a native Cantonese speaker, in comparison to German, for example. And that's why I did the whole thing. And I learned it for a bit, didn't do it very well, and then I dropped it. I don't feel connected enough to that culture.
Mhm.
But
You're not a big enough weeb.
I was not going to say that word. No, I like Japan, but not enough for me to actually get good at the language.
Yeah, you seem to have avoided the common trap of
What do you mean?
learning. Well, so of learning related languages. So Japanese obviously is not technically related to a Chinese language, but it's Sino-Sinic. So it's got a lot of vocab borrowed from Middle Chinese.
We have a lot in common.
It's sort of like, English and the Romance languages.
Exactly.
They're both IE languages, but they're actually quite different. If you were to go back 1,000 years before the Germanic languages and the Romance languages started borrowing from each other, they're quite different. It's different as, say, Welsh is to English. Actually, the European IE languages are actually quite diverse. There's just been a lot of shared vocab. And you have that with Japanese. And there are actually a lot of languages that you could have probably learned easily. Vietnamese, you mentioned Hokkien, obviously
Hokkien.
Mandarin.
Yeah.
And you didn't go down that route of like just gobbling up all of the languages that have Chinese vocab.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I see what you mean. The funny thing is, because the online language learning community is so Eurocentric.
It's incredibly Eurocentric.
It's incredibly Eurocentric.
It's Eurocentric with a little bit of lip service paid to East Asia.
Yeah. And because of that, when I started out, I didn't pay much attention to just other Asian languages. So I was thinking, okay, let's start with English, because obviously you start with English, and then where do you go from here? And then in retrospect, there's a lot I could have done. And I do have a lot of Hong Kong language nerd friends who speak a bunch of Asian languages. But at that point, I was already moving over here, so there's not as much of a point to do so. And one of my biggest regrets related to my time in Hong Kong is that I should have learned Filipino, because it would have been a really easy language to use in the wild, so to speak. Or just any South Asian language to a lesser extent, but to a lesser but still very high extent. But I never did that. I only thought, okay, European language, Japanese, Korean is an option. That's it. But now that I'm here, it makes more sense to learn European languages or languages that you find on this continent.
Mm-hmm.
But I did learn Hokkien, again, initially just as a language that I dabbled in. And also, it's a bit like Japanese in the sense that I wanted to experiment. Because at that point, I'd failed my Japanese experiment. And then I thought, okay, what if I learn a language that is actually related to my mother tongue?
I
And then I did
find
that.
Hokkien to be very weird, and I don't mean that in a bad way,
Go for
but
it.
I just find it very different from other Chinese languages.
It is
Um,
quite different. Like even genetically, it's split
mhm.
off a bit
It's split
more,
off
a bit
earlier.
earlier.
It
Yeah.
does not. So Cantonese and Mandarin, a lot of people get angry when I say this, are closer than Cantonese and Hokkien, because they Cantonese and Mandarin both trace back to Middle Chinese,
Yeah.
whereas Hokkien doesn't.
Yeah.
And
Split off
Hokkien
before Middle Chinese.
avoided some of the sound changes that were shared with Mandarin and Cantonese. The palatalization, tan versus chan, so on
Yeah.
and so forth. And it's very strange. The Hokkien tonal system with
Oh,
the Santi is very,
I love
very
it.
different.
I love
It's
how weird it is.
Yeah, Hokkien just feels very strange, and it sounds very harsh. So, in the Philippines,
There
the
is a community.
primary Chinese language is Hokkien.
Yeah.
And yeah, it feels like Bizarro World Chinese because it's so different from all the other Semitic languages. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I don't
Yeah,
mean
I know what you mean, but to me, it felt closer because it retains some of the features that are primarily distinct Cantonese and Mandarin.
Mhm.
So, because Mandarin versus everything else, basically, right? Mandarin lost a lot of sounds, final sounds in words, and then especially one of the hardest things about Cantonese speakers learning Mandarin is what we call the check tone words, syllables. The syllables that end in PTK, they disappeared in Mandarin, and that's not the main point. The main point is that they turn into something completely different in Mandarin. So because when we learn Mandarin, we sort of could just have a mental converter of sounds. We know that this sound roughly corresponds to that sound, etc. But then these syllables
essentially
completely
random, right?
break that. Yeah, they break the system, and then we make all sorts of weird mistakes. So when I got to Hokkien or Taiwanese, it felt very endearing because they retained those features, and then I could easily convert between Cantonese and Taiwanese.
Hokkien is interesting because it's actually got it lost. Well, I say lost. It changed the checked tone words into a glottal stop.
Yeah,
and then they borrowed back from
Yeah.
Middle Chinese the PTK. So
Yeah.
now they've got a glottal stop as well as the borrowed PTK check tones.
Yeah.
It's sort of like in Filipino, the word for bok choy is pechay. Because pe is white and chai is vegetable.
And what
in
sound
Hokkien.
does the pair end with?
So it's supposed to end with a glottal stop.
Okay.
So like I think in Cantonese bak or something with a K, and you see that sort of inherited loss of the checked tone, and then they borrowed it back, which is something sort of unique to Hokkien, I think.
It is. But it's very comforting to know that when we have a check tone in Cantonese, it's going to be one of the two. It's either the glottal stop or the corresponding PTK.
I've heard that actually Hong Kong Cantonese is starting to have some mergers with the check tones.
With the check tones, less
I feel
so.
like
there are a couple.
K is merging to T or something.
Not very widespread. The most widespread merger would be just one specific word, that is gap, and it became gap. But otherwise, I don't
Hong
know.
Kong Cantonese speakers are losing the velar nasal initial, right? Like ngõ.
Yeah, that is definitely something that's going on. We do a lot of mergers and sound changes with the initials, less so with the final. I mean, there is also the ng becoming the n at the end. So with dang and dan, my dad is incapable of saying dang, so that is something that has been going on for decades and decades.
Yeah. We are almost at time. We've got 10
Oh
minutes left.
no.
And before we go, I did want to ask, what is your take on output? So you're in the Refold community,
Hmm.
but you predate the Refold community. You've been in the polyglot community, the language learning community, about as long as I have, for a long time. You mentioned since you were a teenager, so it's been like 10 years. Um, and obviously you do things your way. You're not like a refolder. So what is your opinion on outputting? I see this a lot with the community where the community is like afraid to output. Um, and we call it output anxiety. Uh, and do you have that, or is that something unique to people who take a high input method and just never speak?
Yeah. Wow. We went for the $1 million question. I, yeah, I am quite concerned for the people who have output anxiety because one of the main things, I would not say the main thing, but one of the main things you want to do with the language is to speak it. But I understand it because I am also a very input heavy guy. And I think that uh, I never avoid output, but I I feel like in this sense I'm a lot I have a lot in common with Steve Kaufman because he who would say that you wait until you feel comfortable and you are able to have a meaningful
But what
conversation.
happens when they never feel comfortable?
So that see that's where it gets personal because for me I have a faith in my process and I know that at some point things make sense. And usually for me that's more about the structure. So for example, Welsh makes sense now to me, even though my vocabulary is very limited. I the sentence structure, it makes perfect sense to me. So this is the point when I would start practicing output, and this is yeah, and that's actually what happened to me because a couple of months ago I booked a package for Welsh on italki. I did 2 classes, and then I thought, no, that this doesn't work for me. It's not. I'm not having any sort of meaningful exchange with the teacher because a lot of time I'm struggling with forming sentences. It's one thing to lack the words, but it's another thing to have the words and like not being able to put them together. But now I'm at the point where I feel like I can, if I have the words, then that's a big if. If I have the words, I am able to put them together uh, relatively easily, and so that's why I just booked another lesson for next week. So I'm restarting output in Welsh. But so to me, I think that's where I draw the line when the structure makes sense to me, and obviously that's a very subjective feeling. But that's my advantage from having learned like a dozen languages. I know where the point is. So I feel like if I were to give advice to anyone, is not a useful piece of advice, but I would recommend they find where the point is for them personally, because everyone's different. And for example, I'm an introvert. I don't. I'm not the kind of person who would like to use the 10 words I have to go and talk to someone. I appreciate people who do that. That's just not me. So that's why I would get anxiety as well, but from a different source. I'm just scared of speaking in front of people. But I think that's perfectly fine because I have faith that at some point it is going to make sense, and that faith partly comes from my experience of learning English, because I did learn English from input because it was at one point in my secondary school life where I had a good foundation in English from studying in school, but I suddenly got very into like tech stuff. So I started reading tech blogs, watching videos, reviews, things like that. And then whenever I found a new word, I would put it down somewhere. I don't necessarily study the words, but I just put it down. So as a very simple mental note that I noticed that word is interesting to me. That is a word that might be useful in the future. And then somehow a couple of years later, I speak English decently well, despite having messed up that that one word. So I know that if I keep doing the same thing, that is going to happen as well in other languages.
So, having learned English to a high level has given you confidence in how you go about learning languages.
Yeah, it gave me trust in the process, I would say. Yeah.
And I think ultimately a lot of us Americans and other Anglophones are chronically monolingual. We
I
did not have that experience. So,
So I sympathize with that. So when someone says you should learn Esperanto just for the experience of learning a language, to learn how to learn a language, even if I don't completely agree with that course of action, I absolutely can see where they're coming from, because once you've done it once, you know how it goes. So yeah, I feel like the best way is to be taught a language well early in life. But if you've already missed that period, you could always find something that will help you get that experience down. And I guess in terms of the Refold community, that is someone else telling you that it works.
yeah, there's a bit of an issue with sometimes Refold coming off as a little culty, like trust the process, bro, it's gonna work. And it's hard to take things on faith.
I know, yeah. Because for me, it's like I get my faith from my experience, but when someone else, even if they've had that experience, even if I tell you now that something works, it feels a bit weird to just take my word for it. So and also, of course, the process is very personal. Like I'm sure that one method would never fit every single learner. So there are some principles that are worth noting, but at the same time, you really need to find what works and what doesn't work, and you need to be sensitive to that as well. Because I've tried different methods as well with my dozen of languages. I've tried doing this, a bit of that, and sometimes I just feel like something's not doing much for my progress.
And you're not afraid to try things. So a lot of people coming into the language learning for the first time, getting into Refold, they wouldn't, you've done Duolingo in some languages. You use things like Closemaster. You're not sticking to the whole Anki to immersion pipeline. You're doing other things on top of it. And I think that that's a good thing, ultimately. I think you see it a lot with people who learn strictly from immersion and strictly from frequency lists. They have these bizarre gaps. Like Bree, for example, she had been learning Spanish for 2 years via immersion. Didn't know the word for coffee pot.
Okay.
Somebody didn't know the word for floor in German after a year of German because it had not come up. Whereas
Exactly.
I think that sometimes textbook vocab is very well rounded, I think.
Yes. That's also kind of why I'm starting to steer back towards textbooks as well, because you need those. What's the English word? Because I know the Polish word. I learned it like last month. You need something to fill in the holes with, and that is. I remember writing my review for Glossica back in the day when it was completely different.
I first did Glossica when it was PDF.
It was PDF. I love the PDFs, but one of my main issues was that, I mean, it's not like Glossica specifically, but with the concept of using one course, it's that I didn't know how to say basic things like boy and girl because it didn't come up in the course. So that was also my issue with what I said earlier about having everything based on one course, because if you just keep using the same course again and again, if the course doesn't have something that you need, you're not going to have that. So you always have to combine different things. And to me, immersion is the thing that sort of boosts your understanding and in your it makes the language make more sense. That is something that I buy into, but at the same time, I'm also more and more aware that I need to do some good old studying, because even though I said I get my experience from learning English, I sometimes forget that immersion learning experience is backed by like 10 years of school study. And there's a lot of vocabulary that had already been there when I started doing my immersion. So yeah, I need to do more different things. And it's hard when I'm a bit too ambitious with my different languages, but it's a trade-off.
Now, Israel, before we go, do you have any parting words for the listeners? Anything you want to say?
Wow, you really put me on the spot. No, I think the most important thing of all in language learning is to have fun. And sometimes I feel like some people forget that.
They make it into a job.
Yeah, exactly. They get too absorbed in the process, too absorbed in the methodology, and whether they make progress or their statistics, some things like that. And then they might forget to enjoy it. And to me, and also I hope to neuroscientists, you learn more quickly when you are enjoying the process. And that's the sole reason I'm doing all of this.
All right. And Israel, thank you for being on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast. If you're watching the live premiere, you're in luck. Right as it ends, we have an after party over on the Refold Central Discord server. Come join us by using refold.link/join and chat about the episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to hear more, you can find older episodes to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. Let us know what you thought about the video by liking and leaving a comment below. Do you have suggestions for upcoming visitors or requests for particular topics? Please feel free to reach out to me on Discord at GeorgePig #5413 or via email at clayton@refold.la. Thank you all for watching and or listening, and I'll see you next week.